A pink flamingo standing in the water, beautiful, alive. Now picture it on a plate, roasted. And the most prized part of the whole bird? Its tongue. The Romans ate that. Not as a joke, not as a dare, as a delicacy. A luxury bite that screamed wealth and power to everyone lucky enough to be at the dinner table. And the flamingo tongue is just the beginning. Because when it came to food, the ancient Romans were completely, gloriously insane. They ate animals you'd never dream of putting in your mouth. They built special machines to fatten up mice. They force-fed pigs figs until their livers swelled up. They flavored almost every single thing they ate with a sauce made from fish guts left to rot in the sun. And they did all of it while calling themselves the most civilized people on Earth. This is the story of what Romans actually ate, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at a Roman banquet the same way again. Some of these dishes are clever, some are genuinely disgusting, and a few are so completely unhinged, you'll have to stop and just sit with them for a second. So if you love this kind of weird, real history, the stuff they never taught you in school, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we drop videos like this every week. Now let's pull up a couch, lie down like a proper Roman, and sit down at the table. Just try not to lose your appetite along the way. Let's start with the one animal that sums up Roman food madness better than anything else. The dormouse. Now, a dormouse is a small rodent, basically a chubby little mouse with a fluffy tail. And to the Romans, this thing wasn't a pest you'd chase out of your kitchen. It was a treasure, one of the most prized, sophisticated, expensive snacks you could possibly serve at a fancy dinner party. Putting dormice on the table said one thing loud and clear: I am rich, and I want every single one of you to know it. But here's where it goes from strange to genuinely wild. The Romans didn't just catch dormice out in the wild and call it a day. No, they farmed them. They engineered them. They built a special container designed for one purpose only: fattening dormice up. And they called it a glorarium. Picture a big ceramic jar, almost like a tall pot, with tiny air holes punched around it so the animal could breathe, and little ramps and shelves built inside where the dormouse could climb and sleep. You drop a dormouse into this jar, seal it in the dark, and then feed it non-stop. Nuts, acorns, chestnuts, whatever would pack on the fat fastest. Inside that dark jar, the animal barely moved. It couldn't run, couldn't burn energy, so it just ate and slept and ballooned in size. It was, quite literally, a tiny meat factory in a pot. And this isn't a guess. Archaeologists have dug these gloraria up in the ruins of Pompeii, so we know exactly what they looked like. They like to catch dormice in autumn, right before the animals would naturally hibernate, because that's when they're already at their fattest. And then, once the little thing was properly fattened up, how did they actually cook it? For that, we turn to the single most important food document to survive from ancient Rome. It's the only Roman cookbook we have, and it's attributed to a famously food-obsessed gourmet named Apicius. His recipe for dormouse is a journey. You'd take the fattened animal and stuff it with minced pork, mixed together with little bits of the dormouse's own meat. Then you'd season all of that with pepper, pine nuts, and of course, fish sauce. You'd sew the animal shut and roast it in the oven or boil it in a pot. And then you'd eat the whole thing, in one go, bones and all. At the most famous dinner party in all of Roman literature, a wild, over-the-top feast thrown by a character named Trimalchio, the dormice arrived rolled in honey and sprinkled with poppy seeds, served like a sweet little candied snack. And to show off even harder, some rich Romans would actually weigh their dormice on scales in front of their dinner guests. A bigger, heavier dormouse meant a bigger flex. Eating had officially become a competitive sport. And here's the detail that tells you everything. At one point, Rome actually passed a law banning the eating of dormice because it was seen as too decadent, too greedy, too over the top, even by Roman standards. So did the ban work? Not even a little. People just kept eating them anyway. It turns out you could not separate a wealthy Roman from his fattened mouse in a jar. Not with shame, not with tradition, and not even with the law. But if the dormouse was the king of weird, then birds were the entire kingdom. Because when it came to birds, the Romans completely and utterly lost their minds. Let's start with the big one, the flamingo, that gorgeous pink bird from the very start of this video. The Romans ate it, and the tongue was the ultimate trophy. Think about what that means for a second. To serve a single dish of flamingo tongues, you'd have to slaughter an entire flock of these birds, dozens of them. And that was exactly the point. The harder something was to get, the more birds you had to kill. The more it screamed to your guests just how obscenely rich and powerful you were. The flamingo's tongue included a big pad of fat and cartilage that Roman gourmets apparently prized above all. And flamingos were just the warm-up act. Rich Romans ate peacocks, those birds with the massive jewel-colored tail feathers. They served peacocks so extravagantly that in the world of Roman meatballs, cooks ranked peacock as the #1 meat, ahead of pheasant, rabbit, chicken, and pork. They ate ostriches, they ate parrots, they ate cranes, doves, pheasants, partridges, quail, and just about any big, flashy, colorful bird their chefs could hunt down or import to impress the guests. The rarer the bird, the more exotic and far-flung, the better. Because remember, this was never really about being hungry, it was about the show. And one Roman emperor took the whole thing to a level that is honestly hard to even believe. Elagabalus, an emperor famous for his completely unhinged excess, once ordered 600 ostriches to be killed. 600. And why? So that his cooks could make him pies out of the birds' brains. Ostrich brain pie. 600 birds slaughtered for their brains for one man's dinner. Just let that sink in for a moment. But it wasn't all giant, dramatic birds. On the complete opposite end of the scale, the Romans also loved eating tiny ones. They ate little songbirds, thrushes, sparrows, orioles, and especially small birds called fig peckers, named because they gorged themselves on figs. And how did they eat these? Whole. You'd pluck the feathers, cook the bird, and then eat the entire thing in a single bite. Head, bones, everything. This exact same tradition actually survived in France for centuries afterward, right up until 1999 when it finally had to be banned because the little birds were being hunted to near extinction. The Romans were doing it 2,000 years earlier. And above all, the Romans loved a spectacle. At some of the grandest banquets, cooks would prepare dishes that released live birds, songbirds that would suddenly burst out and fly around the room the moment the dish was opened, to the gasps and delight of the guests. Food for the Roman elite was never just food. It was live theater. Now let's come back down to earth and talk about farm animals. And there's a genuine twist waiting here, one that goes against absolutely everything you'd expect. When you think meat, you probably picture a nice, juicy beef steak, right? Well, here's the surprise. The Romans didn't really care for beef at all. Cow meat just wasn't popular with them. And the reason is actually pretty logical. Cows and oxen were working animals. They were far too valuable alive, pulling plows through the fields, hauling heavy loads, turning mills. A cow was worth so much more working than it was on a plate. And when you finally did slaughter some old, worn-out ox, the meat was tough, stringy, and unappetizing. Cows were prized mainly for their milk, not their flesh. It's genuinely telling that the Great Cookbook of Apicius contains barely 4 recipes for beef, and most of those recipes just tell you that you can swap in lamb or pork instead if you'd rather. Because the real, undisputed king of Roman meat was pork, and the Romans ate the pig in every single form you could possibly imagine. And when I say every part, I mean every single part. The recipes that survived include dishes made from the sow's udder, the womb, the fig-fattened liver, the stuffed stomach, the brains, the blood, the lungs, the feet, the tail, the kidneys, the intestines. Every last piece of the pig had its own dedicated recipe. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was ever wasted. Brains in particular were used constantly to stuff other animals, to make sausages, and to thicken up rich stews and custardy dishes. They also ate plenty of lamb, goat, and, above all else, game. Wild, hunted animals were actually far more common and more prized than farmed meat because farmed meat was such a luxury. Wild boar was the absolute superstar of the meat world. A whole roasted boar could serve as the dramatic, jaw-dropping centerpiece of an enormous feast, sometimes carried in whole while the guests cheered. They hunted and ate hare. They ate deer. And just like the dormice, they also farmed and fattened snails on purpose, feeding them up until they were plump enough to serve. But there's one particular Roman food invention that's as brilliant as it is brutal, and it deserves its own moment. Foie gras. Yes, that fancy, buttery, fattened liver you probably think of as an exclusively French luxury today. Its roots actually run deep into the ancient world, and the Romans took the whole idea and cranked it up. The technique was as simple as it was cruel. You force-feed geese and ducks, deliberately stuffing them with figs to swell their livers to an unnatural, enormous size. The end result is that rich, fatty, melt-in-your-mouth liver that gourmets have prized for thousands of years. And here comes the signature Roman twist, the kind of move that only they would think of. The gourmet Apicius, according to tradition, decided to take the entire idea one step further. Instead of stopping at geese and ducks, he applied the very same fattening trick to pigs. First, he would deliberately starve the pigs. Then, once they were desperate, he'd let them gorge themselves on dried figs until they were absolutely bursting, all to produce a fat, rich, flavorful pig's liver. The Romans, quite simply, had no limits whatsoever when it came to manipulating an animal to engineer the perfect bite. And this obsession with artificially fattening animals, dormice sealed in jars, geese stuffed through funnels, pigs starved and then bloated with figs, it actually tells you something surprisingly deep about the Roman mind. To them, an animal wasn't just food to be eaten, it was raw material. Something to be shaped, controlled, engineered, and perfected through sheer human cleverness. They brought the exact same ruthless, ingenious, problem-solving mindset to their dinner tables that they brought to building their roads, their aqueducts, and their empire. But before we leave the land behind, we have to talk about how the Romans actually presented all this meat. Because for the elite, cooking wasn't just about flavor, it was about spectacle, illusion, and pure showmanship. And this is where things get truly theatrical. One of the greatest tricks a Roman chef could pull off was the animal inside an animal. Picture this. A cook would take a calf and stuff a whole pig inside it, and inside that pig, a lamb, and inside the lamb, a chicken, inside the chicken, a rabbit, and finally, deep in the center of it all, a single tiny mouse. Layer after layer after layer of animal, cooked together into one impossible dish. It was the ultimate flex, a puzzle box of meat that took enormous skill, time, and money to pull off. When it was carved open at the table, each hidden layer was revealed one by one, to the amazement of the guests. And Roman chefs were obsessed with disguising food to look like something else entirely. It was considered the height of sophistication to serve a dish shaped and flavored to trick your guests. Fish made to look like birds, or one meat carved and molded to imitate a completely different one. There was no practical point to it whatsoever. The entire purpose was to show off just how clever, skilled, and wealthy your kitchen was. If your cook could fool the eyes of your guests, you had won the evening. They'd also serve animals presented as if they were still alive. A peacock might be cooked, then have all of its spectacular feathers carefully reattached and arranged, so it looked like the living bird was strolling right across your dinner table. A roasted boar might be brought in whole, standing upright, arranged in a lifelike pose. The Romans wanted their food to do more than taste good. They wanted it to shock, to dazzle, and to be talked about for weeks afterward. A truly great Roman banquet wasn't a meal, it was a performance, and the animals were the stars. And the exotic didn't stop at what we'd even recognize as food. Romans reportedly ate dolphin meatballs. They ate herons. They ate an electric fish, apparently, simply because the shock it gave was considered fascinating. When your entire culture treats dinner as a competition, there is almost no creature too strange, too rare, or too bizarre to end up on the plate. Now let's dive into the sea, because if the Romans were extravagant on land, then when it came to seafood, they were absolute raving fanatics. In fact, here's something most people don't realize. Fish was actually more common and more beloved in Rome than meat was. The Romans were obsessed with seafood in a way that's hard to overstate. They ate oysters by the boatload, and they farmed them in shockingly advanced sea farms, building entire industries dedicated to oyster cultivation along the coasts. They ate octopus, mussels, clams, scallops, sea urchins, and every kind of fish the Mediterranean could offer. Here's a number that puts it in perspective. In a single sewer in the town of Herculaneum, one of the towns buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, archaeologists found the bones of 43 different species of fish. 43 in one drain. That's the sheer variety that was flowing through the Roman diet. And there was one fish in particular that became an object of pure luxury obsession, the Moray eel. These were big, powerful, sometimes genuinely dangerous eels, and rich Romans raised them in elaborate private ponds at their seaside villas. Some wealthy owners reportedly grew so attached to their Moray eels, or maybe just so proud of them, that they decorated the eels with jewelry and fed them by hand like pets. And there are dark, almost certainly exaggerated legends of especially cruel masters who threatened to throw disobedient slaves into the eel ponds to be devoured. True or not, the stories tell you how these animals loomed in the Roman imagination. But the real, undisputed king of the Roman Sea wasn't an animal you ate whole at all. It was something you made out of them, and it might just be the most Roman thing in this entire video. Garum. Garum was the sauce that ruled Rome. It was in absolutely everything. It was their equivalent of soy sauce, or fish sauce, or ketchup, all rolled into one. A single, all-purpose flavor that defined their entire cuisine from top to bottom. Rich or poor, everyone had garum. And what exactly was it made of? Okay, brace yourself for this one. Garum was made from fish guts and leftover fish scraps. The intestines, the blood, the bits nobody else wanted, all mixed together with a huge amount of salt, and then left out to ferment in the open sun for weeks, sometimes months. Yes, you read that right. Fish innards, slowly rotting and breaking down under the hot Mediterranean sun. During that long process, the fish's own natural enzymes would digest and dissolve the flesh, releasing a liquid. And that fermented, strained, refined liquid was garum, an intense, salty, deeply savory umami flavor bomb that Romans splashed onto almost everything they ate. Meat, fish, vegetables, and even, believe it or not, some desserts and sweet drinks. The smell during production was so overwhelmingly foul that many Roman cities actually banished garum factories to the far outskirts of town, well away from everybody's noses. And yet, here's the paradox. The final product was so incredibly prized and valued that it was traded all across the entire empire like liquid treasure. There was cheap, low-grade garum for ordinary people, and there was staggeringly expensive, top-shelf garum reserved for the rich. Archaeologists have uncovered whole garum production factories scattered right across the Mediterranean world, from Spain all the way to Israel. This wasn't a niche condiment. It was a colossal, empire-spanning industry. So think about that paradox for a second. The very same civilization that ate flamingo tongues and fattened up mice in fancy jars built the everyday backbone of its flavor on a foundation of rotting fish guts fermenting in the sun. The refined and the revolting, holding hands in every single Roman meal. And now, after this entire parade of excess and madness, comes the single most important truth of the whole video. The one that almost nobody ever bothers to tell you. Because everything I've just described to you, the flamingos, the dormice, the peacocks, the ostrich brain pies, all of that was the food of a tiny, tiny minority, the elite. the mega rich, a sliver of the population at the very top. So what did a normal Roman actually eat? The average person on the street? The poor, who made up the overwhelming majority of everyone in the empire? The answer is genuinely boring by comparison, and it's incredibly revealing. The common Roman ate, above all else, grain. Wheat porridge, millet porridge, barley porridge, and bread. That was the absolute, unshakable foundation of their diet, eaten day after day after day for their entire lives. On top of that, they'd add legumes. Dried peas were a total staple of the poor, along with lentils and beans. Some olives, some olive oil, a little cheese, and vegetables like cabbage, which the Romans genuinely believed was incredibly healthy, great for your digestion, and even a solid cure for a hangover. And whatever fruit was in season. And meat? For most ordinary Romans, meat was a rare and precious luxury. Many common people only tasted meat on special occasions and religious festivals, and even then, it was often the leftover meat from animals that had been sacrificed to the gods. Here's a fact that says it all. When Julius Caesar threw a gigantic public feast to celebrate a triumph, he served bread, oil, and wine to hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens, but no butcher's meat at all. That was what generous looked like for the common people. That tells you exactly what normal really was. So that popular image of Romans lounging around stuffing themselves silly with dormice and flamingo tongues, it's completely real. But it's also deeply misleading. Because that was the world of just a handful of the privileged few at the very top. For everyone else, for the vast, sprawling majority of Rome, life was bread, porridge, and beans, with maybe a bit of salted fish or a scrap of cheese if you were having a good week. The same two worlds that always seem to exist side by side. A small group at the top drowning in impossible excess, and a huge crowd below just quietly getting by. So, let's bring it all home. What animals did the Romans actually eat? The short answer is, almost anything they could possibly get their hands on, and a whole lot of things you'd never in a million years imagine. They ate the expected: pork, lamb, chicken, fish, and shellfish. They ate the surprising: wild boar, hare, snails, and hand-fed Moray eels wearing jewelry. And they ate the genuinely, jaw-droppingly unbelievable: mice fattened in sealed jars, the tongues of flamingos, whole peacocks and ostriches and parrots, brains of nearly every animal you can name, tiny songbirds swallowed whole in a single bite, and a sauce built entirely from rotting fish that they proudly poured over almost everything. But here's what all of it really means once you strip away the shock. Roman food, for the rich, was never really about hunger at all. It was about power. Every single strange and exotic animal on that table was a message, loud and clear. I can afford this. I can command the rarest creature on earth to be hunted down, caged, fattened, and killed, all just for one evening of my dinner. The flamingo tongue was never truly about the taste. It was about proving to the entire world that you could have it, simply because you wanted it. And underneath all of that dazzling, grotesque spectacle, the vast majority of Romans were quietly eating the very same humble porridge that their ancestors had eaten for centuries before them. Two Romes, sitting down at two completely different tables, in the very same city, at the very same time. So the next time you see a flamingo, standing peacefully out in the water, pink and elegant and alive, just remember this. Somewhere, 2,000 years ago, a rich Roman looked at that exact same bird, that exact same shade of pink, and the very first thing he thought about was dinner. And that single fact, more than any towering aqueduct or any conquering army, might tell you exactly who the Romans really were.